My name is George Galloway, presenter of كلمة on Mayadeen television. Mind you, I don't mince my words. I speak كلمة and my audience does too. كلمة free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming to you from London and discussing the war in Ukraine. In particular, the biggest terrorist attack that has occurred in the world since 9/11. The explosions on Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines in the Baltic Sea. So great is the release of methane, you can smell it in space. It's official. It has been detected in space. That's how much damage it has done and is still doing to the environment. You know who is behind the terrorist attack. That's obvious, not just from the old question, cui bono, who benefits, but from the absolute silence on the attack on the Nord Stream that has quickly enveloped the whole story. In fact, the authorities in Denmark said that although they were investigating it, took place off their shore, they would not be releasing to any country the fruits of their investigation because it dealt with issues so sensitive to national security that they could not be shared with any country, even Germany, their NATO ally, their EU ally, and of course the owner of the pipeline. So I'm not going to insult anyone's intelligence by seeking to determine who carried out the Nord Stream terror attack. Rather, I'm going to ask my audience of distinguished experts if this Nord Stream attack, if the supply of Russian gas to Europe was in fact fundamental to the reason for the Ukraine war in the first place. I'm not saying I think it is, but many reputable commentators now believe that this US-NATO war against Russia is actually a US-NATO war against Europe. It seeks to fundamentally undermine the economy of Europe, place Europe almost entirely on their knees vis-à-vis the United States and ensure a monopoly, more or less, of American LNG, liquefied natural gas, to the European market. You might think it's a conspiracy theory, but conspiracy theories are so often coming true nowadays, it might be easier to determine whether it's a conspiracy fact. I'm, as always, joined by these experts. I'm merely the enthusiastic amateur. And none is more distinguished than the rambunctious man from Rome who managed to become a Protestant. One day I'll work that out. He is the Reverend Father Frank Gelly, a man of such intellectual distinction and academic achievement that it scarcely needs mentioning. Reverend Frank, am I barking up the wrong tree with this?
You are flattering me too much. I'm just a humble clergyman.
Is it likely that Nord Stream, and rather the dependence on Russian gas of the European Union economy, is the fundamental reason behind the war?
Well, General von Clausewitz, who wrote a famous book on war, said the war is the continuation of politics by other means. So we have here a dirty war pursued by the dirtiest means. There is no question in my mind that this sabotage, this terrorist attack, that's what it was, on the underwater pipeline, gas pipelines, was performed in the interest of the United States of America. Since the days of Barack Obama, America has been barking at Europe, especially Germany, trying to disrupt the relations between Germany and Russia. And it got worse under Trump, of course. Trump placed a number of sanctions. Incidentally, Trump has sanctioned even those who might try to repair the pipelines.
Yes.
To try to do any tests or investigations, they will fall under sanctions. It's a measure of the wickedness, the perfidy of this great power which wants to make our life difficult. Because, of course, this energy which comes to Germany distributed around Europe, Britain has its own dimension, but I mean, many of us will pay higher bills, higher electricity. Some of us will freeze. I mean, my pension is not enough. Even some Francis of Assisi will not be able to survive on my pension. I'm going to freeze because these bastards want to play big power politics and prevent Russia. This is not a war, it's not a cowboy movie like with good guys and bad guys. It's imperialism which is stepping in. There are two imperialisms. And why should NATO go barking at the gates of Russia? Why should they do that? So it seems to me that the situation is quite clear. And it is, incidentally, as you probably know already, the United States has widened the Panama Canal, doubled its capacity, conveying now many of its ships to Europe, to Polish ports, to Lithuania as well, in order to give us its own energy. But I mean, it would be much more expensive than cheap Russian energy. That's the whole point. It would cost much more. So we are falling more and more under the sway of imperialism.
We're lucky that the Americans are doing all this for us. Alexander Mercouris is a distinguished journalist and analyst and the editor-in-chief of the excellent magazine, The Duran. What do you think? Can we park the issue? Was it the Americans? And if so, what does it say about Europe that allows itself to be attacked by its chief ally but continue to follow their orders?
Well, I think there's a lot of things we can say about this which do point firstly to the United States. And let's first say that this isn't the first time that there's been an attack on a Russian pipeline. Many people don't know this or have chosen to forget this, but in 1982, and this is documented fact, there's been books about this in America. People who were involved have discussed it. They've openly boasted about this. Way back in 1982, the Soviet Union, as it then was building pipelines to Europe, gas pipelines. The United States fiercely objected. The Reagan administration, with the signature of the president himself, managed to carry out a covert operation. Software was introduced into one of those big Russian pipelines, Soviet pipelines. This is in 1982. And there was an explosion. This software led to an explosion. It was in Western Siberia. The explosion was of an enormous size. It could be seen from space. So this is not the first time that there's been an attack of this nature on a Soviet or Russian pipeline. And in that case, it is incontrovertible. It is not disputed that the United States was involved. In this case, the latest attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines, there is an important difference because these pipelines, obviously they are largely Russian-owned. Gazprom owns 51% of the Nord Stream pipelines. But of course, the Germans own significant shares. They are part of the European infrastructure, the energy infrastructure. This happened in the seawaters of European states, Sweden, Denmark, Germany. The Russians, the biggest owners of this pipeline, they're excluded from investigation. They're not even allowed to go see what had happened. all of the various countries involved, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, they're conducting investigations which it turns out are independent of each other. These were waters controlled by the United States. The United States has a history of doing this sort of thing. The United States is known to have fiercely objected to these pipelines built from Russia to Europe, extending back to the 1980s. It's a circumstantial case that it was the United States, but frankly, it is a compelling one. I personally would be very surprised if the United States had not been involved in some way.
Dr. Matthew Alford, lecturer in politics, languages and international studies at the University of Bath. By all means say if you demur from the three of our conclusions, but if you don't demur, deal please with the issue I raise, which is what does it say about Europe that would allow itself to be attacked by its chief ally and yet continue to cover it up and follow their orders nonetheless?
I think it says that Europe is accepting its role as a subordinate power in the same way that Britain has long accepted its role since the mid-1950s as a subordinate power within the world international system, playing second fiddle or third fiddle or fourth fiddle to the interests of the United States. I think that the United States, we must remember that every year the United States produces these strategic documents for how it wants to run the world. If you ever take a look at any of those, as I know that you have, they are all about full spectrum dominance, about totally dominating every bloc within the world, which includes the European Union. This goes back to the early 90s with Paul Wolfowitz, the arch neoconservative, and his no rivals plan. But it goes back even into the Cold War as well. And the United States is consistent about this, and Europe just has to go along with it. It's kind of...
What about European public opinion? One can understand why the satrapies in the chancelleries of Europe, presidential palaces of Europe, who are subordinates. But how do their people feel? The German people are a great people, a huge people. Their country is the powerhouse of Europe. Why have they gone so quietly into this good night?
Well, I'm not sure that the people of Europe are going to be hoodwinked for that long, because public opinion can change when material conditions change, as they will, of course, over the winter. But the power of propaganda, as in overt, deliberate construction of lies, does take quite some time for people to see through that. And hopefully that's what the kind of thing that we're doing on this programme and other critical scholars and commentators are attempting to do. But it does take a while for that to before we have a good idea about what's really happened on the
I'm going to come back
level.
to that point, because even I, wizened and experienced as I am, I'm a bit surprised at how effective their propaganda is. Let's hear from Rome. Thomas Fazzi is an Anglo-Italian journalist based in Rome. He's an economic and political analyst and writer. Thomas, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
In your view, is this conflict in Ukraine essentially about sovereignty, or is it about economic issues? Who controls natural resources?
Well, I think that's definitely part of the that's one of the reasons, I think, at the root of this conflict. I think it's clearly it's about much more than just defending the freedoms of Ukraine and of the Ukrainians. In fact, I think that Western powers and the US in particular couldn't give a damn about the rights and freedoms of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are being used as the battleground to wage a proxy war against Russia, first and foremost, but not only. I think this is also a proxy war, a proxy economic war that's been waged against Europe and Germany in particular. So I think the conflict has to be understood in this context, a context in which it has been a geostrategic imperative for the US for decades to avoid a strengthening of Russian-European ties, and especially of Russian-German ties, and more in general, the rise of what could be described as a Eurasian political economic reality that would, independent of the US, that would essentially make the whole NATO architecture redundant. Europe's need for a US controlled security umbrella, and would essentially weaken US hegemony over the European continent.
Isn't one of the main reasons why the US didn't want Nord Stream 2 that they wanted to sell liquefied natural gas to Europe at inflated prices?
And when it comes to Nord Stream 2, again, the US has been very explicit over the years about the need to stop Nord Stream 2. The US has actually passed several bills in Congress throughout the years, one in 2017 and one in 2019, essentially slapping sanctions on companies involved in the construction of Russian pipelines in general, but Nord Stream 2 in particular. And in fact, the actual work on the work on the pipeline was actually stopped for a year because of these U.S. sanctions. And so we have several statements by very high-profile U.S. politicians over the years, which have said, that Nord Stream 2 must be stopped, essentially, because that was imperative to U.S. interests. And of course, there's also, it was a double advantage. It would have been a double advantage for the U.S. to stop Nord Stream 2 because the U.S. By that point had also a booming fracking industry and liquefied natural gas industry, which it hoped to export to Europe. But of course, so long as Europe was importing cheap gas from Russia, it wouldn't have had any reason to turn to the US for what is more expensive liquefied natural gas.
In one of your recent articles, you asked a question. Let me ask that question of you. How can Europe possibly survive this bitter cold winter coming on fast at prices that nobody can afford?
Well, yes. I mean, I think there's a complete understatement of the effects that this energy crisis not only will have in the near future on the European economies and societies more in general, but that is already having on Europe. We know that entire industries across the continent have been forced to scale back production or stop production altogether, especially energy intensive, gas intensive industries such as the fertilizer industry. We know there's big problems in the food industry and other sectors that have been really very hard, severely hit by the energy crisis. And so it seems pretty clear to me that Europe can't afford to stay on this course for potentially years, which is what European leaders nonchalantly speak of nowadays. We've heard European political leaders say that this is going to be the situation for the coming years, and I think it was the Belgian Prime Minister who spoke of this crisis, lasting 10 years. And I think this is complete madness. Of course, Europe can't in any way survive a prolonged energy crisis without, as I wrote in that article, plunging into absolute chaos and anarchy. I think, the only thing, the kind of neoliberal model is based on the idea that you're able to provide basic you're not able to provide much in terms of fulfilling life, fulfilling jobs and so on and so forth, but at least you're able to provide basic material needs to not everyone, but most of the population, and that includes of course being able to turn your heating, heat your house and light your house and so on and so forth. I think if even these basic things are taken away from people, and not to mention, of course, what will be mass unemployment in the face of deindustrialization caused by the energy crisis. I think it's pretty clear that that's going to spark some pretty intense reactions and backlashes from people, and which we're partly witnessing already. I mean, just look at what's happening in France these days. Massive upheaval, massive industrial unrest, violent protests rocking several cities throughout the country, and so I think that might be the kind of scenario that other countries we'll be looking at very soon as well, I think.
You live in Italy. How can the Italian people survive the oncoming bitter winter? Will the new government of Giorgia Meloni, right-wing government, will they keep them warm?
Well, I think Italy will face a very harsh winter because this government is not going to do hardly anything to manage the energy crisis. In fact, it's not even proposing any serious economic scheme to cushion the effects of this crisis, and that's because the Meloni knows very well that it's not up to her to decide what to do about the energy crisis in Italy, because Italy, as most Euro countries, especially all Euro periphery countries, has no economic sovereignty, and so really, it's all the major economic decisions are taken in Brussels and Frankfurt. We're not. It's not up to the next Italian government to decide what to do about the energy crisis. Unfortunately, it's up to the technocrats in Brussels and Frankfurt. I mean, this is so. For all the talk of fascism coming to Italy as a result of Meloni's win, I think the real fascism is in Brussels and is in Frankfurt and is in this European architecture that has completely deprived nation states of sovereignty and therefore of democracy. So it's not up to us, I'm afraid. It's up to the technocrats in Brussels, and I don't expect they will do much to ease the suffering of the Italians or of Europeans more in general.
Is that true, Father Frank? Your country has no economic sovereignty, and therefore whom it elects isn't worth a row of beans.
The economic sovereignty point is probably correct, but I believe politics comes before economics. So there are political decisions which Meloni could take, and one is trying to break this pestilent consensus over a matter of Ukraine, trying to find a way ahead. It was even indicated by the Pope in one of his latest Angelus address on a previous speech which he gave to Jesuits in Central Asia, that you should try to find a diplomatic solutions. It is not a battle of good versus evil. And incidentally, Elon Musk, who recently tried to make some kind of sensible comment, I mean, hell was unleashed. That super idiot of Labour MP Chris Bryant, who was at theological college with me when I was at Caddisden Theological College, he went on to be ordained, but also later on became an MP. He was asking for sanctions in Parliament on Elon Musk. I mean, how absurd can we be?
If it moves, sanction it.
Yeah, that's it.
That's the rubric. Yeah. But Meloni could, politically speaking,
well, she has
play a role.
Yes, and she will, I believe. Incidentally, she's also a fan of The Lord of the Rings or Tolkien. Once again, that's the medieval fight, and there are all sorts of monstrosities which we have to combat. So in that sense, maybe that's an allusion to the European Union.
Much more of this coming up after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalamahora with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming from London, talking about the Ukraine war. Let's get a view from across the Atlantic now, from Washington, from Jamal Thomas, journalist and commentator and presenter of the excellent Fault Line show in the last 7 years on Radio Sputnik. Jamal, welcome.
Excellent. Thank you for inviting me.
Many people believe that the current conflict and the attack on the Nord Stream pipeline was all about the US stopping relations, energy relations, economic relations, and the fear of political relations between the European continent and Russia.
I think it's both. I think it's geopolitical and economic. I think from one standpoint, you have the US and the West hates, specifically the US, hates the idea that Europe is dependent upon Russia, who they consider to be a geopolitical enemy, for fuel. And so it's like you get this conflict. Look, from my standpoint, NATO has been trying to encircle and to prevent any sort of power center that was being created after the remnants of the Soviet Union. And so that was the reason why, even though all of them understood we're not going to expand in NATO to the inch to the east, not only did they expand it an inch to the east, they expanded to the borders of Russia. And that's even going so far as to knock over the government of Ukraine in order to use it as a tip of a spear to do so. I think a lot of this has to do with geopolitical interests and economic interests, and they were kind of dovetailing in with one another. In one sense, the US, look, even though they came up with a policy of containment, what they ended up doing was basically pushing Russia and China together, which created more difficulties for them. I think there's this understanding that this kind of hegemonic control of the world is basically shifting and changing. And they're taking this kind of proactive, aggressive action in order to try to stymie it. But I got to be honest, in doing so, they're making their situation that much more worse. And it seems to be willing to eat through Europe, even if it means in order to get to Russia. All of this has basically come to naught. I mean, less than naught. The US is dealing with economic numbers that are utterly abysmal, not to mention job losses and everything else that are expected. Europe is no magical door to get itself out of that situation that it is in at all. And at this point, it's dealing with economic and political degradation as a result. I think it's both. I think it's geopolitical interests and economic interests. And I think those things are dovetailing to the detriment of Europe. And for that matter, even to the detriment of the US in regards to this notion of power projection that they typically ran with. It's both.
Well, you say both, but I mean, it's inescapable, really, that the one beneficiary of this whole mess is the United States of America, your country. The reality is the Ukrainians have lost, the Russians have lost, the Europeans have lost, second to the Ukrainians only, and the only people who benefited is the US. Isn't that correct?
Agreed. 1,000% agree. I mean, if you look at what's taking place, it's almost as if, and you hear the complaints now, you hear France complain, oh, we're supposed to be in this together and you're charging us so much for this fuel. And it's like, what did you expect? I mean, it became clear early on that there was a difference in regards to the damage that the US was taking versus the damage that Europe was taking. And they still kept running towards that cliff. And so you're seeing this kind of weird deindustrialization of Europe. Not only can they not afford the gas or the oil or energy prices, but they're also stuck with issues of food because energy basically affects everything else. So whereas the US dollar is strengthening, you have the pound that is falling through the floor, you get the euro that is basically collapsed, and you get industries that are in Europe that are basically potentially leaving. I mean, they're talking about a deindustrialization of Europe where companies either collapse, close up, or for that matter, move to the United States where they can pay less in taxes, or for that matter, less in energy costs. Europe is taking a massive hit for this. I mean, roving blackouts in Europe, think about that. Like, this is not, I always say, this kind of far off place in Africa. This is Europe. This is supposed to be this kind of economically dominant peer of the US. And at this point, it doesn't look like that. What it looks like is you're going to get alternate economic systems like the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, or for that matter, BRICS. And these organizations are basically raveling this hegemonic control that the West basically had. That's over. I mean, even when you look at Reuters made it very stark. Whatever the issues they're dealing with this year, if they can magically get themselves out of it, next year is worse.
Isn't anarchy a potential outcome of all this? After all, if people can't survive, can't heat their homes, can't feed their families, keep a job, isn't anarchy on the agenda?
Well, I don't know about anarchy. I mean, definitely protests. Definitely you're going to get people very angry. I mean, you can see it now in Prague, for example, protests in Prague. France, protests in France. Of course, they tried to ignore it, but those protests are there. You get governments collapsing. So the Italian government, like Draghi, basically fled the ships like rats fleeing a ship. He didn't have to leave. He left because he didn't want to deal with the damage and be responsible for it. Meaning you're getting political destabilization as a direct result of what Europe is enduring. And even the Italian government, I mean, they're talking about what? They're going to have to live on 68 degrees, basically, to turn the temperature down. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of businesses shutting down. I don't know if it's anarchy, but it's definitely is going to be consequences. Look at Britain, look at the pound. The pound is basically falling through the floor. It is near parity with the dollar. The pound used to be, £1 used to equal to $2. That is a direct result of what these guys have basically chained themselves to in regards to the US. I don't know if it's anarchy, political destabilization, yes. Riots, potentially, yes. Protests, absolutely.
Are the Americans laughing at us as they see Europe volunteer to commit economic suicide, to lose everything to the United States?
That's a weird, like, that is more of a question for Europeans, right? Like, I've asked people in Europe, like, why do you do this? Like, it is absolutely clear that you guys are taking a hit for this and you have no way out for this. And their response is, well, the US is the leader of this stuff and we follow the US. It's very, I mean, from our standpoint, I don't even know if Americans pay that much attention to foreign policy unless it directly affects them. And so you don't really hear too much conversation about, especially in our media, how bad Europe is taking. It may come up, they may talk about it a bit, but you must understand, oftentimes the way that this stuff is talked about in US media ignores all of the reality of it, meaning it drops all context. So from their standpoint, Putin did it. You guys started an economic war. You expanded NATO. You didn't fulfill the Minsk agreements. You decided to knock over the government of Ukraine and put NATO in the Constitution. And if you're going back, William Burns, net means net. William Burns back in 2008 was very clear. If you continue along this pathway, you are going to create frictions within the country that is going to cause potentially a civil war that Russia is going to have to get involved in that it doesn't want to do. William Burns is not a psychic. He doesn't have magical powers. This was only back in 2008 because it was clear as day that this was going to be an issue. I don't know if Americans see it in those terms because those terms are never necessarily explained. It is one of those things, though, that regardless of whether the European public or the American public fully grasp, like fully get the details of how abominable their politicians have basically behaved and acted in a sense. If it comes to something that is going to hurt them or hurt us, we are going to take issue with it, and Ukraine is going to matter less. Doesn't matter. The propaganda that they're basically giving doesn't matter. The media drops context. If it hurts us or if it hurts Europe, that's when we're taking issue with it. From this standpoint, America doesn't fully grasp, because that stuff is basically ignored, what its government has done to create this particular situation. All they know is Biden is president, Biden did it. But I don't think they get the level of devastation that Europe is encountering or is going to go through in the foreseeable future. I don't think they get it.
Dr. Matthew, you, like me, and like Alexander for that matter, we're in the soft power business. You're a documentary filmmaker, Theatres of War, your latest piece of work. Why have those who oppose empire, who are the victims of empire, invested so little or so poorly in soft power? Because as Jamal explained that, I thought, fantastically well, it's amazing that not everybody in Europe is marching behind us right now.
I completely agree. I think the United States has got a very long history of being extremely good at telling stories. And I think it's been accepted around the world that the United States, through Hollywood and through its dominant media systems, we defer to them to do that. We allow them to provide those stories. I mean, I think there's something interesting about the representation of Russia, for example. Over the last 20 years in particular, you could name countless films, but even recent TV series like 24 and Homeland and Stranger Things, all using Russian villains on a constant basis. I mean, are there any films that you can think of in which there isn't a vodka-soaked Russian thug or a dictator? Or, so there's a real mood music constantly of Russia being this implacable foe, and that their leaders just simply cannot be negotiated with.
Despite the fact, sorry to interrupt, that Russia helped to save Britain's ass during World War II.
Of course, yeah, and Russia is often airbrushed out of World War II histories, at least the popular histories, and so it means that we're set up with this situation where culturally we see Russia almost. We don't really associate Russia so much with the ballet. We associate Russia with these horrible political and military acts, and of course, all great powers do horrible military acts, as Russia has, but it's a very dangerous situation where we have culturally the idea that that Putin, the Russian government, and the Russian state as a whole is simply, there's nothing we can do about it except for to attack and repel them purely by force. It means that we can never really, until we get over that as societies, we can never really enter into a discussion about what the future is going to be of Europe, of Ukraine, short of just two or many different blocks smashing together, and there's going to be an explosion there, and with no real, there's going to have to be a very clear loser.
Alexander, all of that was explicable when Russia was part of what was, for a time, an existential threat to the capitalist way of life. When the Soviet Union commanded a huge landmass and a big ideological following in almost all countries. But Russia is now a capitalist country. Moreover, a Christian capitalist country. Why do they hate it so much?
Why indeed? Well, I think it's not just Russia, and I think before we discuss that, there's a few points I want to make, which is that we mustn't underestimate how radical the change in America's relations with Europe we are now seeing. Historically, during the Cold War, the United States consolidated its bloc in Europe by allowing the Europeans a fair degree of political space and by ensuring that Europeans had higher living standards, material living standards, than the other side. Now, what we are seeing, and it's entirely concerted, is a steady attempt to restrict both that political space and also sacrificing European living standards. So if you go back to the Iraq War, which of course you know incredibly well, Schroeder and Chirac, leaders of Germany and France, opposed the United States over the Iraq War. You go back further, Margaret Thatcher opposed American attempts to build gas pipelines between the Soviet Union and Germany. She was opposed to the Americans. She was actually supporting these pipelines. Go back further still, you have de Gaulle speaking out against the Vietnam War. All of that has ended. The United States no longer tolerates political leaders in Europe who speak out in that fashion. And one has to say this isn't just that the political leaders in Europe have changed. Of course they have. But this hasn't happened by itself. You can see that in the media as well. The media, every year it becomes more restricted. Every year social media in Europe becomes more restricted. The window of political debate is getting narrower all the time.
Reverend, Alexander mentioned that Russia makes its own political choices, and that's difficult for the US to accept. Wasn't one of the most significant of those the decision not to allow the Syrian government and its capital, Damascus, to fall to the dark forces of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the alphabet soup of Islamist extremism? Wasn't Russia coming to the defense of Syria unpardonable in Washington?
Yes, that is another sort of move in this geopolitical sphere. Russia's support of the Damascus government did cross the United States a great deal. How dare they interfere in our backyard? I think that Russia played a very positive role there by confronting these extreme forces, which present only a small section of Islam by using some of local malcontents and so on. But that is part of this geopolitical. So, but I think you got to come down to reality, to realism here. We got to defend the rights of people see the rights of Europeans who don't want to freeze to death, and America, who was the late lamented Colonel Gaddafi, said America's number one enemy of humanity. Now, I don't agree with that. I think America is probably number 3 world enemy of humanity. And I'm not going to mention who the first 2 are.
What a great pity. That would be a scoop, I think.
I will be in trouble.
Matthew, I'm trying to get at why they hate Russia so. Isn't it the key point that Alexander made, that 2 key points? One, that Russia makes its own decisions. It does not accept orders from the United States. And 2, its ever closer relationship with China. I mean, China and Russia are now effectively one country, economically speaking, certainly. Militarily, undoubtedly, if pushed too far. And therefore, we see looming into view, don't we, what Orwell wrote about in 1984, a permanent state of we have always been at war with East Asia. Is that the future that we look forward to, if that's the word?
Well, we've certainly come from a bipolar world of 2 great powers in the Cold War to arguably a unipolar world in which the United States was the key power, where it hit that in, say, the late 1990s. And now we're in a multipolar world. And a multipolar world, just because it sounds more democratic and power is more diffuse, is not more stable than either of those 2. Whether that is the same as Orwell's 3 great powers constantly trying to jostle with each other, I'm not sure if we'll quite get to that stage. I would say another thing about the reason why the populations of the West are struggling to conceptualize an idea of coming out of this, or to strengthen their opposition to the United States, I think is also about cultural attitudes towards nuclear weapons. Because I think it was very, very clear during the Cold War that nuclear weapons were completely unusable, they mustn't be used, they're extremely frightening, and that they were a major problem. And now I think the last 30 years that has just gone away. And so I think, and what's filled that gap is all sorts of crazy, I wouldn't necessarily call them conspiracy theories, but I do see around a lot people saying, well, maybe Putin will use a nuclear weapon, but then if he does, his military will assassinate him, or India will sort it out, or something. All sorts of crazy ideas are coming into this vacuum due to the ignorance, widespread ignorance, about how nuclear wars are fought. And we know from the way that all of the war games have ever been plotted that the use of one nuclear weapon is extraordinarily likely to lead to absolute devastation.
Armageddon, as Joe Biden put it. It's true, Alexander. You and I are of an age that we remember the 1980s, the sighting of cruise Pershing missiles here, a huge uprising of CND, mass demonstrations all over Europe. None of that seems to exist anymore.
Not only that, but the party in Germany, which was most associated with opposition to cruise and Pershing missiles, which was the Greens, is now the most belligerent party in Germany. It's the party that is leading, if you like, the crusade in Germany and indeed in Europe against Russia, which wants to sort of heighten this confrontation to an extraordinary degree. Now, you talked about conspiracy theories at the beginning of the programme, and in fact, the point to understand about conspiracy theories is that they are theories about conspiracies, and anybody who has spent any time working, and I used to be a lawyer in my previous life, conspiracies do exist. They actually happen in real life. Now, not every conspiracy theory is rational, but some, they do happen. Now, I find it very difficult to understand how a party like the Greens could have changed its position so completely. I remember the leaders of the Greens in the late 1970s and early 1980s, people like Petra Kelly and General Bastian, her partner, and they would never have countenanced the policies we see from the Greens today. So it seems to me that there is a concerted effort, and has been a concerted effort, to close down again memories of nuclear weapons, the Hiroshima, Nagasaki, which we used to talk about all the time in the Cold War. CND, which used to be this enormous movement, has disappeared.
I can fill in some blanks on that, because literally in the documentary that we've been doing, one of the sections we have is about how the Department of Defense PR department has deliberately and quite extensively excised any reference to nuclear weapons or problems with nuclear weapons in films going back decades. Includes in films like Godzilla, for example. Godzilla was always, as a franchise, as a story, was a critique of the use of nuclear weapons on Japan. But now by 2014 and other films around are using the same characters, it's now nuclear weapons are, they're a really good thing. They're used to, to try and destroy the monster. They're not actually part of the problem. They're part of a solution.
Yes.
An extraordinary business. Final word to you, Reverend. Of course, as Alexander puts it, the Greens, the Social Democrats, the Labourites, the so-called liberals and socialists with a small s, have all become the war party.
Yes,
Can I speculate that you hope that the new right-wing Prime Minister of Italy might actually be an unexpected hope?
Well, I agree that they have become the war party, especially in this country, under Starmer, the Labour Party. Absolutely despicable. It's interesting, a point about the Greens in Germany, a betrayal of their heritage. Let's not make too much of the Meloni government. She represents a little potential for breaking this pestilent consensus over Ukraine. But I would not say that it's beginning of the end. No, I'm afraid not. And incidentally, a point about nuclear weapons. Since in the last, the Americans have fought two wars, which they have lost, Vietnam and Afghanistan. And they never dreamt of using nuclear weapons. So you can have nuclear weapons, doesn't mean you have to use them.
Well, they lost two. Maybe they think the Ukraine is third time lucky. It doesn't look like that on the battlefield, but that in itself is perhaps more dangerous.
Yeah. Can I make a point here? Because I have to disagree with you on one thing.
Please
the
do.
United States, twice since the end of the Second World War, has seriously considered using nuclear weapons in an armed conflict.
But MacArthur in South Korea, yes.
In Korea.
And stopped by Truman.
And in fact, Eisenhower apparently pushed for the armistice agreement that was made. He actually told the Soviets that, if this doesn't happen, the possibility of the US using nuclear weapons in Korea is a real one. But the other occasion, less well known but thoroughly documented, was in 1968 during the Vietnam War, when there was a US military base called Khe Sanh, which had been surrounded. And the US military, General Westmoreland, who was the commander, did undoubtedly consider using tactical nuclear weapons in that particular battle.
As someone said, the war is too important to leave it to the generals.
Indeed.
So they were overridden.
Having heard all this, maybe we were lucky that the Nord Stream pipeline was only hit by 100 kilograms of TNT. It could have been worse. I hope you have enjoyed this discussion, if enjoyed is the right word, about issues so momentous. I've been George Galloway. You've been a wonderful audience. This has been Kalima Hora.